If I don't get there in 10 minutes, he's not going to make it. The words left Ava Johnson's mouth steady, almost too calm for the chaos flashing around her. Red and blue lights slicing through the humid Georgia night like broken glass. Rain tapping against her windshield in uneven rhythms, each drop catching the strobe and turning it into something sharper, colder. Officer Daniel Brooks stood just outside her driver's side window, one hand resting near his radio, the other lifted slightly as if holding the moment in place. His silhouette cut hard against the glare of his cruiser. "Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them," he said, voice controlled but edged with suspicion. Ava didn't move, both hands fixed at 10 and 2 on the wheel, fingers trembling just enough to feel, but not enough to show. Her scrubs still carried the faint scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. A 12-hour shift behind her, but none of that mattered now, not with the cooler in the passenger seat humming quietly. A small digital monitor blinking a steady green light that reflected faintly across the dashboard. Brooks leaned in slightly, eyes scanning the interior, pausing on the medical bag, the sealed container, the tubing coiled with precision. "What's in the bag?" he asked, tone shifting. "Sharper now?" Ava swallowed once, her throat dry despite the damp air. "It's blood," she said, simple, direct, no hesitation. The words seemed to hang between them. Heavy, misunderstood. Brooks' jaw tightened. A second officer lingered behind him, glancing toward the growing line of cars slowed by the scene, headlights stretching into the distance like a silent audience. Somewhere, a phone lifted, recording. Ava could feel it without looking, the weight of eyes, of judgment, of assumption. Brooks straightened slightly, rain catching on the brim of his hat, sliding down in thin lines. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, not louder, but firmer, procedural, final. Ava didn't argue, didn't rush. She moved carefully, deliberately, opening the door with one hand while the other stayed visible. Her sneakers touched wet pavement, cool water seeping through the thin soles, grounding her. The night air wrapped around her, thick and electric. Brooks gestured toward the hood of the car, maintaining distance, control. "Why are you transporting blood?" he asked, each word measured like it already carried doubt. Ava glanced once at the cooler, the green light still blinking, steady, indifferent to the tension outside. "Because someone needs it," she replied, voice softer now, but not weaker. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that carried more disbelief than anger. "You have documentation for that?" he asked. Ava nodded slightly. "In the glove compartment," she said, but neither of them moved toward it. Not yet. The moment stretched, thin as wire, the rain picking up just enough to blur the edges of everything. Lights, faces, certainty. Ava lifted her chin just a fraction, meeting his eyes for the first time, not defiant, not pleading, just present. "If I'm late," she said again, slower this time, "he dies." The words didn't rise, didn't fall. They settled, and for a brief second, something in Brooks' expression flickered, not understanding, not yet, but something close to it, before the radio on his shoulder crackled, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness wide open. The radio crackled again, louder this time, a burst of static cutting through the rain like a blade. "Unit 12, confirm status," the voice said, distant but urgent. Brooks did not respond immediately, his eyes still locked on Ava, measuring, weighing, deciding what version of her story he was willing to believe. The second officer shifted his weight behind him, boots scraping lightly against the wet asphalt, glancing between Brooks and the growing line of headlights stretching down the road. Engines idling, people watching, recording, waiting for something to happen. Ava remained still, her hands now relaxed at her sides, but her shoulders held a quiet tension, the kind that came from knowing time was moving whether anyone else respected it or not. Brooks finally reached up and pressed the button on his radio. "Stand by," he said shortly, then released it. The static faded, leaving only the sound of rain tapping against metal and glass. "Open the glove compartment," he said, his tone returning to procedure. Ava nodded once, slow and deliberate, turning slightly, each movement controlled, visible. She reached inside the car, fingers brushing the edge of the compartment before pulling it open. The interior light flickered on, revealing a stack of folded papers, a worn registration, a a small envelope marked with hospital insignia. Brooks stepped closer, but kept his distance, eyes narrowing as he gestured. Use 2 fingers, take it out. Ava followed exactly, no faster, no slower, sliding the envelope free and holding it out. The paper slightly damp from the humidity. Brooks took it carefully, unfolding it under the flashing lights, his eyes scanning the printed text, official logos, signatures, timestamps. His jaw tightened again, but differently now, less certain. Emergency transport authorization, he read quietly, almost to himself. The second officer leaned in slightly, trying to catch a glimpse. What is it? He asked. Brooks did not answer right away. His eyes flicked back to Ava, then to the cooler on the passenger seat. The faint hum still steady, the green lights still blinking, patient, indifferent to delay. You are telling me this is for a hospital? Brooks asked, his voice lower now, less confrontational. Ava nodded. Grady Memorial, she said, her voice carrying just enough urgency to cut through the noise without raising. Rare blood type, pediatric case, she added, the words precise, practiced, not dramatic. Brooks looked back at the paper, then at the road, then at Ava again. The rain had begun to soak through his sleeves, darkening the fabric, but he did not seem to notice. Why are you driving it? He asked, the question softer, but still guarded. Ava took a small breath, steadying herself. Because the courier was delayed and the lab could not wait, she said. They asked for a volunteer, and I was already there. Brooks studied her face, searching for cracks, inconsistencies, anything that would justify the tension still coiled in his stance. But there was nothing loud in her expression, no panic, no defiance. Just a quiet certainty that did not bend under pressure. Behind them, a car horn sounded briefly, then stopped. The line of traffic growing restless. The second officer glanced back again, uneasy. We are backing up the road, he muttered. Brooks ignored him, his attention fixed on the situation in front of him, the kind that did not fit neatly into the rules he was trained to follow. Procedure says I verify before releasing you, he said finally, almost like he was reminding himself. Ava nodded once. Then verify, she said, not challenging, not impatient, just stating the obvious. Brooks hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around the paper. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, sharper now. Unit 12, be advised. Incoming request from Grady Memorial. They are asking for status on a delayed transport. Repeat, delayed transport. The words landed differently this time, not as noise, but as confirmation. Brooks froze for a fraction of a second, the smallest pause, but enough to shift the weight of the moment. Ava did not move, did not speak. She only watched him, the rain continuing to fall, the light continuing to flash, the clock continuing to run whether he acknowledged it or not. Brooks slowly lifted his radio again, his voice no longer as firm as before. Dispatch, confirm details, he said, the tension in his shoulders no longer just control, but something else, something closer to doubt. And for the first time since the lights came on behind her, Ava allowed herself a single breath that reached deeper than the last. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. Dispatch did not answer immediately, and that silence felt louder than the sirens reflecting off the wet asphalt. Brooks kept the radio near his mouth for a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for certainty to arrive fully formed instead of pieced together. Then finally the response came through, clipped but clear. Unit 12, confirm you are with vehicle transporting emergency blood unit. Type O negative pediatric priority. Destination Grady Memorial. Transport flagged critical delay. The words settled into the space between them like a verdict that had not yet been spoken out loud. Brooks' grip on the radio loosened just slightly, his eyes shifting back to Ava, not sharp anymore, but searching, recalibrating. Confirm, he said into the radio, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. Stand by, dispatch replied, and the line went still again, the rain filling in the gaps with a steady rhythm. Ava glanced toward the cooler, the small digital monitor now blinking a different pattern, a subtle change, but enough for her to notice. Her chest tightened for a brief second before she steadied her breathing again. She had seen that shift before. It meant the temperature was drifting, not dangerously yet, but not ideal either. Time was no longer just urgent, it was narrowing. Officer, she said softly, not to interrupt, but to remind. Brooks looked at her immediately, like the word itself had weight now. The unit needs to stay within range, she added, her voice even, controlled. Brooks followed her gaze to the cooler, really looking at it for the first time, not as a suspicious object, but as something precise, something important. The green light flickered once, then returned to steady. The second officer stepped closer now, lowering his voice. If dispatch is confirming, we might want to clear this, he said, not pushing, but suggesting. Brooks did not respond right away. His eyes moved from the cooler to Ava's face again, and there it was, the smallest fracture in his certainty, not gone, but no longer solid, the kind that comes when a story stops fitting the assumptions it was built on. Behind them, another horn sounded, longer this time. Someone rolled down a window. The faint sound of a voice carried through the rain, frustrated, impatient. The scene had become something people were no longer just watching, but reacting to. Brooks exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooler night air. Then he looked down at the paper in his hand again, as if confirming it had not changed in the last few seconds. It had not, but his understanding of it had. The radio crackled again, sharper, more urgent. Unit 12, confirm immediate release. Hospital reports patient condition critical. Repeat, critical, delay not advised. This time there was no ambiguity, no room left for interpretation. Brooks closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone to call it hesitation, but long enough for him to feel the weight of the decision shift fully onto him. When he opened them again, something had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone not paying attention, but enough. He lowered the paper, his posture adjusting, not losing authority, but redirecting it. You said 10 minutes, he said to Ava, his voice different now, grounded in something closer to responsibility than suspicion. Ava nodded once. Less now, she replied. Brooks glanced at his watch, water droplets clinging to the glass, the seconds moving whether he agreed with them or not. He looked back at his cruiser, then at the line of traffic, then finally at Ava again. And for the first time since the lights had come on, he saw her not as a variable in a situation, but as part of the solution. The radio remained silent. Waiting, the second officer stepped back slightly, already sensing the shift. Brooks reached up and keyed his radio again, his voice steady, decisive. Dispatch, Unit 12 confirming emergency transport, initiating escort to Grady Memorial. The words changed everything without raising in volume. The moment did not explode. It realigned. Ava's shoulders lowered just slightly. Not relief. Not yet. But alignment. Brooks stepped back from the car, gesturing clearly now. Get in. I will lead, he said, not as an order, but as direction. Ava did not hesitate. She moved quickly but carefully, sliding back into the driver's seat, hands returning to the wheel, the cooler still humming beside her. Brooks turned toward his cruiser, rain trailing off his uniform as he moved with purpose now. The red and blue lights shifted in intensity as he opened the door, the engine already running, the path ahead no longer blocked, but defined. Behind them, the line of cars began to part slowly, like a curtain opening. The second officer moved to direct traffic, his gestures firm but no longer tense. Ava looked forward, her breath steadying, the road stretching out ahead, wet and reflective, every second now measured not by doubt, but by distance. Brooks' cruiser pulled ahead, lights cutting through the night, and for the first time since the stop began, the sound of motion replaced the sound of waiting. The road opened ahead of them in a narrow stretch of wet asphalt reflecting the pulsing red and blue lights like a ribbon of broken color. Brooks accelerated just enough to clear the path, without losing control, his hands steady on the wheel now, for a different reason, not tension, but focus. Ava followed closely behind, her eyes locked on the cruiser in front of her. The distance between them measured in feet, but carrying something heavier than space. Every second counted now in miles per hour. The rain had softened, but the air still felt thick, pressing against the windshield. The wipers moved in a steady rhythm, clearing just enough for her to see what mattered. She glanced briefly at the cooler, the green light steady again, but dimmer somehow. Or maybe it only felt that way. She reached over and adjusted the latch slightly, making sure it was sealed, her fingers careful, practiced. She had done this before, just never like this. Never with time this tight, and eyes this aware, ahead. Brooks keyed his radio again. Dispatch, requesting traffic priority clearance. Eastbound lanes toward Grady Memorial. 2 vehicles, emergency transport. His voice carried authority now, not forceful, but aligned. Dispatch responded quicker this time. Unit 12, copy. Traffic control notified. Proceed. The confirmation landed differently than before, not as validation, but as responsibility. Brooks glanced in his rearview mirror, catching a brief glimpse of Ava's headlights steady behind him. Not drifting, not hesitating. She was keeping pace, trusting the path he was creating. The thought lingered longer than he expected. Then he focused forward again. The next intersection approached. Normally a place of hesitation, but tonight the traffic lights shifted ahead of them. Green holding longer than usual, cross traffic slowing, drivers noticing the lights and pulling aside. The city adjusting in small ways that added up to something larger. Ava exhaled slowly, her grip on the wheel loosening just enough to feel again. The tension in her shoulders still there, but no longer tightening. She passed through the intersection, the road opening wider, the buildings on either side reflecting the movement in blurred streaks. Somewhere in the distance a siren echoed, not theirs, but part of the same system now working around them. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Minutes slipping, not lost yet, but close enough to feel. Brooks slowed slightly as they approached a curve, then accelerated again once the road straightened, his movements precise, controlled. He was no longer thinking about the stop, about the doubt, about the assumptions that had shaped the first moments. Those had not disappeared, but they had shifted, replaced by something quieter, heavier. The awareness that his decision had consequences beyond procedure. He adjusted the angle of his lights slightly, signaling to a line of cars ahead. They began to move, parting just enough. Ava followed, her eyes scanning constantly. The road, the mirrors, the cooler, the clock. Her breathing steady now, not calm, but directed. Every part of her focused on the same point ahead. The hospital lights would be visible soon. She knew the route by memory, but tonight it felt longer, stretched by everything that had happened before. Brooks keyed the radio again. Grady Memorial. This is Unit 12. 2 minutes out with emergency transport. There was a pause. Then a voice came through, urgent but controlled. Unit 12, we are ready. Bring it straight to emergency intake. Brooks nodded slightly even though they could not see him. Copy that, he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of what had nearly been delayed. Ava heard the exchange through her open window, just enough to confirm what she already knew. She pressed slightly on the accelerator, closing the gap just a little, not too much, just enough to feel the connection between them tighten. The hospital building came into view at the end of the stretch, lights bright against the dark sky. A fixed point in everything that had been moving. Brooks slowed as they approached the entrance, then angled his cruiser toward the emergency intake lane, clearing the space. Staff already waiting under the overhang. Silhouettes moving with purpose. Ava pulled in right behind him, braking smoothly, the engine idling for a fraction of a second before she reached for the cooler, her hands steady again. The door opened, the sound of rain softer here under the cover, but still present, still real. Brooks stepped out of his cruiser at the same moment, the distance between them now measured in steps instead of doubt. He did not speak immediately. There was no need. The path had already been made. Ava moved toward the waiting staff, placing the cooler into their hands with care, their movements quick but precise, practiced. The exchange took seconds, but those seconds held everything that had led to them. Brooks watched from a few feet away, his hands at his sides, no longer directing, just witnessing. The doors to the emergency intake opened, then closed again, and for the first time since the lights had flashed behind her on that dark road, everything went quiet in a way that did not feel like tension, but release, subtle, incomplete, but real. The doors had barely closed when the rhythm of the hospital took over, fast but controlled, voices low but urgent, footsteps moving with purpose across polished floors that reflected the overhead lights in long, sterile lines. Ava stood just inside the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, her hands empty now, still curved slightly, as if they remembered the weight of the cooler. The absence of it felt strange, like something unfinished. A nurse in navy scrubs passed quickly beside her, offering a brief nod of recognition. Not surprise, not curiosity, just acknowledgement, the kind given when time matters more than questions. Ava exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her deeper than before. Not relief, not fully, but something close to it. Behind her the rain continued to fall, softer now, tapping against the overhang. Brooks remained just outside the threshold. His presence paused between two spaces, the street behind him and the hospital in front of him. He watched the doors for a second, then stepped inside, his boots quieter on the tile than they had been on asphalt, the shift in sound noticeable, grounding. He removed his hat without thinking, holding it at his side, water still clinging to the brim. Ava turned slightly when she sensed him near. Their eyes met briefly, not with tension, not with judgment, but with something unspoken that neither of them seemed ready to name. "They will take it from here," she said quietly, her voice steady again. Brooks nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate. "They said 2 minutes," he replied, as if repeating it gave it shape. Ava glanced toward the hallway where the staff had disappeared, the doors still closed, the light above them steady. "That is enough," she said, not confidently, not doubtfully, just truthfully. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the silence between them stretching, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. He looked down at the floor for a brief moment, then back at her. "I should not have held you," he said, the words direct, without decoration. Ava did not respond immediately, her eyes steady on his, measuring not the apology itself, but the space it came from. "You followed what you believed," she said after a second, her tone even. Brooks let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "That is what worries me," he replied, the honesty in his voice sharper than anything he had said before. Ava studied him for a moment longer, then looked away, not dismissing him, but releasing the weight of the exchange. A doctor pushed through the doors then, moving quickly toward the desk, speaking in low, urgent tones. The staff responded immediately, the rhythm picking up again. Ava stepped back slightly, giving space, her hands now resting loosely at her sides. Brooks watched the movement, the efficiency, the quiet coordination. It was different from the kind of control he was used to, less visible, but no less precise. A nurse emerged briefly from the hallway, speaking to someone just out of view, then disappearing again. Ava's eyes followed her, searching for something, not information, but confirmation. Brooks noticed. "Do you know who it is for?" he asked, not out of suspicion, but curiosity now. Ava shook her head slightly. "Only that it is a child," she said, the word carrying more weight than the rest of the sentence. Brooks nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward the closed doors again. The seconds stretched, quieter now, no sirens, no radios, just the hum of fluorescent lights and distant footsteps. Then the doors opened again, not wide, just enough for a nurse to step out. Her expression focused but softer than before. She looked around briefly, then her eyes landed on Ava. "You brought it?" she asked. Ava nodded once. The nurse gave a small, relieved smile, the kind that did not celebrate, but acknowledged. "It made it in time," she said simply, the words landing gently but firmly. Ava closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way that did not show outwardly, but was unmistakable if you were close enough to see it. Brooks exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him longer this time, as if something he had been holding without realizing it had finally let go. The nurse disappeared back through the doors, the hallway swallowing the movement again. The moment settled, not dramatic, not loud, just complete. Ava turned slightly toward the exit, the rain still visible beyond the glass, the night unchanged in appearance but different in weight. Brooks hesitated, then spoke again. "I can walk you out," he said, not as an order, not even as a question, just an offer. Ava looked at him, then toward the doors, then back again. "I can walk," she replied, her tone calm, but not dismissive. Brooks nodded, understanding more in what she did not say than what she did. They stood there for one more second, the space between them no longer filled with assumption, but not entirely empty either. Then Ava stepped toward the exit, the doors opening quietly as she approached, the sound of rain returning, softer now, almost steady enough to feel like silence. Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her go, the reflection of the lights fading across the glass as the door closed behind her, leaving him standing in a place that felt the same, but no longer was. The rain followed her out like a quiet echo, Softer now, but steady enough to coat the pavement in a thin reflective sheen. Ava stepped onto the walkway with measured pace. Her shoes damp again within seconds, the hospital lights behind her casting a pale glow that stretched her shadow forward, long and narrow across the ground. She did not rush. Not anymore. The urgency that had driven every movement minutes ago had settled into something slower, heavier. Her hands slid into the pockets of her scrub jacket, fingers curling slightly, as if searching for something to hold. But there was nothing there, just the lingering warmth of motion now gone still. She exhaled and let the air out slowly, watching it disappear into the night. Across the lot, Brooks stood just inside the glass doors, not moving, not following. His reflection layered faintly over the scene outside, his hat still in his hand, the edges of it dripping onto the tile. He had not realized how still he had become until the automatic doors slid shut behind Ava and the sound of the rain softened again, like the world had stepped one pace away from him. He looked down briefly, then back up, his eyes following her figure as she moved farther from the entrance, not to watch her leave, but to understand what had just happened in a way that procedure had never taught him. A nurse passed behind him, brushing his shoulder lightly without stopping. He barely noticed, his focus still fixed outward. Ava reached the edge of the covered area and paused for a moment. Not because she had somewhere to go, but because she did not. Not immediately. Her car remained parked near the intake lane. Engine off now, quiet. The same vehicle that had been surrounded by flashing lights earlier. Now just another silhouette among many. She looked at it, then at the road beyond. The same stretch of asphalt that had held tension, doubt, delay, now empty. Almost ordinary. She took a step forward into the open rain, the water cool against her skin, grounding. She tilted her head slightly upward, letting a few drops land against her face before lowering her gaze again, across the glass. Brooks finally moved. One step, then another, slow at first, then more certain. He pushed through the doors, the sound of rain growing louder again as he stepped outside. The air cooler now, carrying the scent of wet pavement and something cleaner underneath. He stopped a few feet behind her, not close enough to intrude, but not distant either. Ava sensed him there without turning, the quiet between them different now, not tense, not expectant, just present. It made it, she said softly, more to the night than to him. Brooks nodded even though she could not see it. They said it did. He replied, his voice steady but lower than before, like he had learned something about volume in the last hour. Ava shifted her weight slightly, her eyes still on the road. That is what matters, she said. Brooks let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, something in between. It is, he agreed, then hesitated, the next words not coming as easily as commands or confirmations. I keep thinking about the moment I told you to wait, he said finally, the sentence unfinished in tone even as it ended. Ava turned her head slightly now, just enough to acknowledge him without fully facing him. You did not know, she said. Brooks shook his head once, a small movement. I assumed, he corrected, the word landing heavier than the rain. Ava studied him for a second, then looked away again, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture softened just slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Assumptions are faster than truth, she said quietly. Brooks absorbed that. The simplicity of it, the accuracy, the way it explained more than he was ready to admit out loud. A car passed slowly at the far end of the lot, headlights sweeping briefly across them before moving on. Neither of them moved. The moment holding, not stretching, just existing. Brooks glanced toward her car, then back to her. Do you need an escort back? He asked, the word chosen carefully this time. Ava shook her head. No, she said, then added after a second. I know the way. Brooks nodded, understanding the layers in that answer more than he would have before. He looked down at his hat, turning it slightly in his hands, then back up. For what it is worth, he said, pausing just enough to make sure the words mattered. You handled that with more patience than I deserved. Ava did not respond right away, the rain filling the silence again. She finally turned to face him fully now, her eyes steady, clear. It was not about you, she said, not harsh, not cold, just honest. Brooks held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly, the truth of that settling deeper than anything else had tonight. Ava turned back toward her car, taking a step forward, then another, her pace unhurried, the distance between them growing naturally, not forced. Brooks remained where he was, watching her go for only a second this time before looking down at the wet pavement beneath his feet. The reflection of the hospital lights broken by the movement of rain. He stood there a moment longer, then lifted his head, the night unchanged in appearance, but something within it, and within him, undeniably shifted. The sound of her car door opening cut softly through the rain. A small, ordinary click that carried none of the tension from before. Ava slid into the driver's seat with the same controlled movement she had used all night. But this time her shoulders lowered fully against the backrest, the fabric of her scrubs damp against the seat, the faint scent of rain mixing with the lingering antiseptic from her shift. She placed both hands on the steering wheel for a moment without turning the key, just feeling the stillness, the engine silent, the world no longer pressing against her from every direction. Outside, Brooks remained near the edge of the covered walkway, his figure partially lit by the hospital lights, partially swallowed by the darker edges of the lot. He watched her for a second longer than necessary, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but because the moment no longer belonged to him. Ava finally turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum, familiar, grounding. She adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, catching a brief reflection of herself, tired eyes, rain-damp hair, a face that looked the same as it had before the stop, and yet carried something different beneath it, not visible, but present. She shifted the car into drive and eased forward slowly, careful, deliberate, the headlights cutting a clean path across the wet pavement. Brooks glanced back as the movement registered, his posture straightening slightly, a reflex more. Then a decision. The car rolled past him at a slow pace, not rushed, not hesitant, just moving. Ava kept her gaze forward, but as she passed, she lifted one hand briefly from the wheel. Not a wave, not acknowledgement, just a small motion, almost instinctive. Then her hand returned to its place. The car continued forward, merging into the quiet road beyond the hospital, the red glow of the brake lights fading into the distance. Brooks stood still for a moment after she passed, the rain tapping lightly against his shoulders, his hat still in his hand. He turned it once more between his fingers before placing it back on his head, the gesture slower than usual, more intentional. Behind him, the hospital doors opened again, a stretcher rolled through, staff moving quickly, their voices low but focused, the rhythm continuing, unchanged by what had just happened outside. Brooks glanced over his shoulder, watching the movement briefly, then looked back toward the road, now empty again, just a stretch of wet asphalt reflecting the streetlights in long, quiet lines. He stepped forward once, then stopped, as if deciding whether to return to his cruiser or remain where he was. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly, a routine call coming through, another situation, another moment waiting somewhere else. He reached up and pressed the button. Unit 12, go ahead, he said, his voice steady, but different now, not in tone, but in weight, as if each word carried a fraction more thought than before. Dispatch responded with directions, coordinates, something ordinary, something that would have filled his focus completely just hours ago. He listened, nodding slightly, then responded, copy that, en route. The words automatic, but not empty. He took a step toward his cruiser, then paused again, his eyes drifting once more to the direction Ava had gone, the road already swallowing any trace of her presence. Only the faint memory of headlights remaining in his mind. He exhaled, slowly, the breath visible in the cooler air, then turned fully this time, walking toward his vehicle with a measured pace, each step deliberate, not rushed, not delayed, just chosen. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar interior surrounding him, radio chatter low in the background, the scent of damp fabric and plastic filling the space. He rested his hands on the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, mirroring the stillness Ava had held just minutes earlier. Though he did not realize it, the engine started with a low rumble, the dashboard lights flickering on, casting a soft glow across his face. He looked ahead through the windshield, the rain still falling, the night unchanged in appearance, but not in meaning. He pulled out slowly, the cruiser moving back onto the road, the lights no longer flashing, just steady, just present. As he drove, The reflection of red and blue no longer filled the glass, replaced instead by the quiet lines of streetlights and passing buildings. The city continuing as it always did, but for him, something in the way he saw it had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to stay, enough to follow him into. Whatever came next, the radio continued to speak, directions, updates, the routine of the job, but beneath it, quieter, steadier, was the echo of a voice that had not raised, had not demanded, had not fought, and yet had changed the direction of everything. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines as Ava drove away from the hospital, the rain easing into a fine mist that barely touched the windshield. The wipers now moving slower, almost unnecessary, the city lights reflecting in soft streaks across the glass. She kept both hands steady on the wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present, her breathing even now, though her chest still held a faint echo of the urgency that had carried her through the last hour. She passed through an intersection where the light turned green just as she approached, the timing effortless, almost symbolic, but she did not think about it that way. She simply drove, the hum of the engine grounding her, the faint tick of cooling metal from the hood reminding her that motion had replaced stillness. She glanced briefly at the empty passenger seat where the cooler had been, the space now just fabric and shadow, but it felt heavier than before, as if something invisible had been left behind and something else had taken its place, something quieter, deeper. She exhaled slowly and adjusted her grip on the wheel, her fingers no longer tense, just resting. Behind her, far enough now that the hospital lights had faded into the distance, Brooks drove in the opposite direction, his cruiser moving through familiar streets that felt slightly unfamiliar tonight, not in layout, but in meaning. He passed the same intersections he had driven through countless times, the same storefronts closed for the night, the same streetlights casting steady pools of light onto the pavement. But his attention moved differently now, not scanning for threat alone, but noticing details he would have ignored before, a pedestrian waiting patiently at a crosswalk, a car slowing earlier than expected, a reflection in a window that showed his own cruiser moving through the dark like a quiet signal instead of a warning. His hands remained steady on the wheel, but his posture had shifted, less rigid, more aware. The radio continued to speak, routine updates, calls, locations, but he listened differently, filtering not just for urgency, but for context, for what might not be said directly. He slowed slightly as he approached another intersection, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The light was green, but he looked both ways anyway, a small adjustment, almost invisible, but deliberate. Somewhere in his mind, the image of Ava standing in the rain, hands visible, voice steady, replayed without effort, not as a memory he forced, but as one that stayed. He exhaled slowly and continued driving, the rhythm of the road settling into something calmer. Back in her car, Ava turned onto a quieter street, one lined with small houses and dim porch lights, the kind of place where the city noise softened into something more personal. She slowed as she approached her block, the tires rolling gently over wet asphalt, the sound softer now, less urgent. She pulled into her driveway and shifted the car into park, the engine idling for a moment before she turned it off, the sudden silence filling the space around her. She did not move immediately, her hands still resting on the wheel, her gaze forward, not focused on anything in particular, just holding the moment. She let out a long breath, one that seemed to carry everything that had happened with it, not releasing it completely, but easing it, her shoulders lowered fully now, the tension that had held them tight finally letting go. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a brief second, the quiet inside the car wrapping around her, not empty, but full in a different way. After a moment, she opened her eyes and reached for the door handle, stepping out into the damp night air, the rain now barely more than a whisper. She walked toward her front door, her steps steady, unhurried, each one grounded in the simple fact that she had arrived. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the knob, then glanced back toward the street, the road stretching out in both directions, empty, ordinary. She held that view for a second, then turned back and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. Across town, Brooks pulled his cruiser to the side of the road briefly, not for a call, not for a reason that would fit into a report, but because he needed a moment that did not involve movement. He placed the vehicle in park and rested his hands on the wheel, just as he had done before driving, mirroring a pause he did not consciously remember seeing. He looked ahead through the windshield. The rain now reduced to faint streaks under the streetlight, the city. Quiet around him, the radio still murmuring in the background, but he did not reach for it. Not yet. He sat there for a few seconds, then lifted his hand and turned the volume down slightly. Not off, just lower, enough to create space. He leaned back in his seat and let out a slow breath, the kind that came from understanding something without fully being able to explain it. He looked down at his hands, then back up at the road, the reflection of the streetlight stretching across the wet pavement, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed the silence to stay without filling it, not with orders, not with assumptions, just with the awareness that something had shifted, not outside, not in the city, but within the way he would move through it from this point forward. Morning came quietly, without urgency, without flashing lights or raised voices, just a pale wash of sunlight slipping through the thin curtains in Ava's living room, stretching across the wooden floor in long, soft lines. She stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee held between both hands, the warmth steady, grounding, the faint sound of a morning news broadcast playing low from the television in the other room. Not loud enough to demand attention, just present. She had not slept much, not because she could not, but because her mind had stayed awake longer than her body, replaying moments not in chaos, but in clarity, the way the rain had sounded against the windshield, the way the officer's voice had changed, the way time had pressed against every decision until it no longer could. She took a small sip of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter, her gaze unfocused, not lost, just thinking. The television volume shifted slightly as the anchor's tone changed, subtle but noticeable, something in the cadence pulling her attention without forcing it. She stepped into the living room slowly, the mug still in her hands, her eyes moving to the screen. A headline scrolled across the bottom in bold letters. Local, recent, familiar. She did not react immediately, just watched. The footage that followed was not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a clip taken from a distance, grainy but clear enough. Red and blue lights reflecting across wet pavement. A car stopped. A figure standing beside it. Another figure near the hood. Voices not audible, but the posture, the movement, the tension, all recognizable. Ava's expression did not change, but her grip on the mug tightened slightly. Not from fear, not from anger, just from recognition. The anchor spoke in measured tones, describing the situation, the delay, the eventual escort, the hospital confirmation, the words careful, neutral, but carrying weight in what they chose to include and what they left unsaid. Ava exhaled slowly, setting the mug down on the table beside her, her eyes still on the screen. The clip shifted, showing the hospital entrance, staff moving quickly, the cruiser pulling in, the car following close behind. The moment condensed into seconds, but she knew how long it had truly been, how every second had stretched. The segment ended without commentary, just a brief transition to the next story, something unrelated, something ordinary. The television continued, but Ava reached for the remote and turned it off, the room falling quiet again. She stood there for a moment, the silence settling around her, not heavy, not empty, just present. She picked up her mug again and took another sip, the coffee now cooler, but still warm enough to hold. Across town, Brooks sat in his cruiser parked outside the precinct, the engine off, the radio silent, the morning light reflecting faintly off the windshield. He had arrived earlier than his shift required, not because he needed to, but because staying at home had felt like standing still in a place that no longer fit the same way. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his lap, his uniform pressed, his posture composed, but his thoughts moving slower than usual, not racing, not avoiding, just processing. The same footage played on a small television mounted in the corner of the break room, visible through the open door. He had seen it once already, not fully, just enough to recognize the scene, the angle, the moment captured by someone else's phone. He had not gone inside to watch it again, not because he could not, but because he already knew what it showed, and more importantly, what it did not. He reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, not out of necessity, but habit. His reflection looking back at him, unchanged on the surface, but carrying something beneath it that did not fade with daylight. He exhaled slowly and opened the door, stepping out into the morning air, the sounds of the city returning in a different form, distant traffic, voices, the low hum of a day beginning. He closed the door behind him and stood there. For a moment, the cruiser quiet, the world moving. He looked toward the entrance of the precinct, then back at the street, the same roads he had driven countless times, now holding a different weight, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. He took a step forward, then another, walking toward the door with a pace that matched the rhythm of everything he had begun to understand, not rushed, not delayed, just steady. Inside her home, Ava moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly, the street outside calm, neighbors beginning their day, cars passing at a normal pace, nothing out of place, nothing demanding attention. She watched for a moment, then let the curtain fall back into place, the lights softening again. She turned away from the window and picked up her keys from the table, holding them for a second before slipping them into her pocket. Her shift would begin again soon. Another day, another set of moments that would not announce themselves ahead of time. She walked toward the door, pausing briefly with her hand on the handle, not out of hesitation, but awareness. Then she opened it and stepped outside. The morning air cool against her skin, the world unchanged. And yet, in the quiet way that mattered most, not the same. The hospital floor carried a different kind of silence in the early afternoon, not empty, but controlled, the kind that lived between footsteps and low voices. Ava moved down the corridor with a steady pace, her badge resting lightly against her chest, her shoes making soft contact with the polished tile, each step measured without thought. The rhythm familiar. She had already checked 2 rooms, updated charts, spoken to a family that needed clarity more than comfort, and now she paused just outside a set of double doors marked pediatric intensive care, her hand hovering near the handle for a brief second before she pushed it open. The air inside cooler, quieter, machines humming softly in the background like distant echoes. She stepped in and scanned the room quickly, not searching for something unknown, but confirming what she already expected. A small figure lay in the bed, surrounded by equipment that spoke in quiet signals. A nurse stood nearby adjusting a monitor, her movements precise, practiced. She glanced up as Ava approached and offered a small nod, not formal, just acknowledgement. Ava returned it and stepped closer, her eyes moving to the child, pale but stable, the rise and fall of breathing steady, not labored, the kind of rhythm that meant the body had accepted what it needed. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing in a way that did not need to be seen to be real. The nurse leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "He is responding well," she said, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet relief beneath it. Ava nodded once, her gaze still on the child. "Good," she replied softly, the word simple, but enough. Across town, Brooks stood inside the precinct briefing room, the low murmur of conversation filling the space as officers gathered around, some leaning against desks, others seated, the television mounted on the wall, now showing something unrelated, the earlier footage already replaced by routine updates. He stood near the back, not trying to blend in, but not stepping forward either, his arms crossed loosely, his posture composed, but his attention focused. The supervisor at the front spoke in measured tones, reviewing reports, procedures, standard reminders, the words familiar, the structure predictable. Brooks listened, not tuning out, but not fully anchored either, his mind holding on to something else, something that did not fit neatly into the categories being discussed. The supervisor paused briefly, glancing at a sheet in his hand, then looked up. "There was an incident last night involving a delayed emergency transport," he said, the room quieting. Slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Brooks did not move, but his focus sharpened. The supervisor continued, outlining the situation in broad terms, not naming names, not assigning blame, just describing the sequence, the delay, the eventual escort, the outcome. "The patient is stable," he added, the words landing in the room with a subtle shift in atmosphere. Some officers nodded, others exchanged brief glances. The moment acknowledged, then absorbed. Brooks remained still, the confirmation, aligning with what he had already heard, but hearing it here, in this room, carried a different weight, not personal, but institutional. The supervisor looked around once more. "We are reviewing protocol to ensure clarity in situations like this," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Use judgment, but verify context before escalation." The sentence simple, but it settled deeper than it might have the day before. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, his expression unchanged, but something behind it more defined. Back at the hospital, Ava stepped away from the bedside, giving space as another nurse entered, carrying a small tray. The routine continuing, she moved toward the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle before she paused, turning back for one last glance, not out of doubt, but acknowledgement. The machines continued their quiet rhythm, the room steady. She nodded once to herself, then stepped out into the hallway, the doors closing softly behind her, the corridor returning to its familiar pace. She walked forward, her steps even, her focus shifting to the next task without resistance. Not because she had forgotten, but because she did not need to hold on to it to understand its meaning. Across the city, Brooks stepped out of the briefing room into the hallway, the noise fading behind him. He walked toward the front desk, his pace steady, not rushed, not delayed, just deliberate. He paused briefly near the window, looking out at the street, cars passing, people moving, the city continuing without pause. He rested his hand lightly against the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm. Grounding, he stood there for a second, then pushed away, and moved toward the exit, the door opening with a quiet mechanical sound. The air outside warmer now, the day fully awake. He stepped onto the sidewalk and looked down the street. The same road, the same movement, but his perspective no longer the same. He adjusted his hat slightly, then began walking toward his cruiser, not because he had to, but because there was still work to do, and now, a different way to do it. The afternoon light shifted gradually across the hospital corridor, turning the polished floor into a soft reflection of movement and shadow. Ava moved through it with quiet consistency, her steps measured, her attention anchored in the rhythm of the day. She paused at the nurse's station, scanning a chart, updating a note with careful handwriting, each detail precise, each line intentional, a small part of a much larger system that depended on accuracy more than speed. A colleague approached from the side, setting down a clipboard with a light tap. "Room 12 is asking for you," she said, her tone neutral but knowing. Ava looked up briefly, nodding once. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm. She set the pen down and turned toward the hallway again, her pace unhurried but direct. As she walked, the sound of a child laughing faintly from a nearby room caught her attention. Unexpected, soft, but clear. She slowed for just a second, not stopping, just registering it, then continued forward, pushing the door open to room 12. Inside, a woman sat beside the bed, her posture tired but attentive, her hands resting gently over a small blanket. The child beneath it looked smaller than the space around him, but his breathing steady, his eyes half open, aware. The woman looked up as Ava entered, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to relief. Not dramatic, just real. "You are the one who brought it," she said, not a question, but a quiet recognition. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, then stepped closer. "I helped," she replied simply. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "He is still here because of that," she said, her voice low, steady. Ava glanced at the child, then back at the woman, her expression unchanged, but something behind it acknowledging the weight of those words. "He is here because everyone did their part," she said gently, not deflecting, but placing the moment where it belonged, shared, not owned. The woman studied her for a second, then nodded again, understanding more than the words themselves. Ava reached out and adjusted a small detail near the bedside, a monitor lead, a blanket edge, movements quiet and practiced, then stepped back slightly, giving space again. The room settled into a calm rhythm, the kind that followed urgency, not erased, but resolved enough to breathe. Across the city, Brooks sat inside his cruiser once more, parked along a quiet street lined with trees that filtered the afternoon light into scattered patterns across the hood. He watched the road ahead without focusing on any single point, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, not gripping, not idle, just present. The radio remained on, but the volume lower than before, Voices passing through in fragments, locations, updates, routine calls. He listened, but not with the same urgency that once drove his reactions. Now there was space between the words, room to consider, to understand context. Before response, a call came through. A simple traffic stop request. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. He reached up and acknowledged it. Unit 12 responding, his voice steady, but carrying something quieter beneath it. He pulled the cruiser back onto the road, the motion smooth, controlled, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm. As he approached the location, he slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but intention. The vehicle ahead came into view, parked at the curb, hazard lights blinking in a steady, predictable pattern. He pulled in behind it, the distance measured, safe, his lights not flashing yet, just present. He sat there for a moment, watching, not assuming. The driver remained inside, still, waiting. Brooks exhaled slowly, then reached for the switch, activating the lights. Not as a signal of control, but of procedure. He stepped out of the cruiser, closing the door softly behind him. The sound muted in the afternoon air. He approached the vehicle at a measured pace, each step deliberate, his eyes scanning, but not searching for threat, just observing. He stopped at the window, pausing for a second before speaking, giving space, giving time. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice even, calm. The words simple, but chosen. Inside the vehicle, the driver turned slightly, hands visible on the wheel, posture composed. The moment held for a second, not tense, not rushed, just present. Brooks stood there, aware of the space, the history, the weight of moments that could unfold in many directions, and for the first time, he allowed that awareness to guide him before anything else. Back in the hospital room, Ava stepped toward the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, the child's breathing steady behind her, the quiet of the room holding. She glanced back once more, not out of doubt, but acknowledgement, then opened the door and stepped into the corridor, the light shifting again as the afternoon moved forward, the day continuing, not as it had been, but as it now was, shaped by choices that had already been made and those still to come. The late afternoon settled into a quieter tone across the city, the kind that softened edges and slowed movements without stopping them. Ava stood near the nurse's station once more, reviewing a final set of notes before her shift transitioned, her pen moving steadily across the page, each word clear, intentional, the routine grounding in a way that did not erase what had happened, but placed it within something larger, something continuous. A colleague leaned against the counter nearby, glancing toward the hallway before looking back at Ava. "You did good yesterday," she said casually, not making a moment of it, just stating something that had already been understood. Ava paused her writing for a fraction of a second, then continued, her expression unchanged. "We all did what was needed," she replied, her voice even. The colleague nodded, accepting the answer without pushing further. The conversation ended as quietly as it had begun, the hospital moving around them with steady precision. Ava finished the note and set the pen down, her hand resting briefly on the chart before she closed it, the small motion marking an end that did not need announcement. She stepped away from the station and moved toward the exit of the unit, her pace calm, her posture relaxed in a way that came from resolution rather than fatigue. She passed by the pediatric room once more, the door slightly open now, a soft light spilling into the hallway. She glanced in briefly, the child resting. The machines quiet, the mother seated close, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Ava did not enter. She did not need to. She simply acknowledged the moment and continued walking. Across the city, Brooks stood beside his cruiser on a quiet side street, the engine off, the lights no longer flashing, just the faint reflection of the late sun across the windshield. He had completed the routine stop, the interaction calm, uneventful, but different in a way that did not show in reports or summaries. He rested one hand on the roof of the vehicle, feeling the warmth of the metal beneath his palm, grounding. The driver he had stopped had already left, the street returning to its normal rhythm. A few cars passing, a pedestrian crossing at the far end, nothing out of place. Nothing urgent. Brooks remained there for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. He looked down the street, the long line of asphalt stretching forward, The same kind of road where everything had shifted the night before, and for a brief second, he saw it layered over the present, the reflection of flashing lights, the sound of rain, the weight of a decision that could have gone another way. He exhaled slowly, then stepped away from the cruiser, opening the door and sitting inside. His movements unhurried, deliberate. He placed his hands on the wheel, the same position as before, but not the same state of mind. He did not start the engine immediately. Instead, he reached for the radio and adjusted the volume slightly, not to hear more, but to create balance. The voices coming through steady, predictable, part of a system that relied on response. He listened for a moment, then keyed the mic. Unit 12 available, he said, the words simple, but carrying a quiet clarity beneath them. Dispatch acknowledged, the routine continuing, but the way he would move through it no longer unchanged. Back at the hospital, Ava stepped through the exit doors into the open air, the light softer now, the sky shifting toward evening. She paused just outside, not from hesitation, but from awareness, the air cooler against her skin, carrying the faint scent of the city settling into night. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keys, turning them once between her fingers before starting toward her car, her steps steady, her shoulders relaxed. She moved through the parking lot with the same quiet intention she had carried all day, not rushed, not delayed, just present. She reached her car and opened the door, placing her bag on the seat before pausing again, her hand resting on the frame. She looked out across the lot, the lights beginning to turn on, one by one, small points of brightness in the growing dusk, the hospital behind her continuing its work, unseen but constant. She exhaled slowly, then slid into the driver's seat, closing the doors softly behind her, the interior quiet, familiar. She started the engine, the low hum returning, steady. She adjusted the mirror slightly, not to check her reflection, but to align her view, then shifted into drive, the car moving forward at a smooth, even pace, across town. Brooks finally started his cruiser as well, the engine coming to life beneath him, the dashboard lights flickering on. He glanced once more down the road, then placed the vehicle into gear, pulling out with a measured motion, the streetlights now beginning to glow, casting long reflections across the pavement, both of them moving through the same city, in different directions, carrying the same moment in different ways, not as something that needed to be held onto, but as something that had already done its work, quietly, completely, and without needing to be spoken again. The night settled over the city in a slow, quiet descent, streetlights stretching their glow across the pavement like soft markers of direction rather than control. Ava drove with the windows slightly cracked, letting the cool air move through the car, carrying away the last traces of the day. Her hands rested lightly on the wheel, no tension left in her grip, just presence. The road ahead clear, familiar, but no longer unnoticed. She stopped at a red light and waited, not impatient, not distracted, just aware. A car pulled up beside her, music low, someone inside laughing softly. Life continuing in small, ordinary ways. She glanced forward again as the light shifted to green, then moved, smooth and steady, each motion grounded in something deeper than routine. Across town, Brooks drove through a different part of the city, the radio quiet for now, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. He passed through an intersection where a pedestrian hesitated at the curb. Unsure, Brooks slowed before reaching the line, offering space without signaling urgency. The person crossed, giving a small nod. Brooks returned it without thinking, his hand lifting slightly from the wheel, then settling back. The moment simple, unnoticed by anyone else, but not empty. He continued driving, the cruiser moving through the night without the need for flashing lights, just steady, present, a part of the city rather than something imposed on it. Ava turned onto her street, the houses lined in quiet rows, porch lights glowing softly. She pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine, the sudden silence filling the car again, but this time, it did not carry the weight of exhaustion, just completion. She sat for a moment, her reflection faint in the darkened glass, then reached for the door, stepping out into the night air. The sky above clear now, the earlier rain only a memory held in the dampness of the ground. She closed the door behind her gently and walked toward her house, her steps slow, not from fatigue, but from awareness. She paused halfway to the door, looking back toward the street, the same road where nothing seemed to have changed, and yet everything had, not visibly, not loudly, but in the quiet way that shaped what came next. She turned and continued inside, the door closing behind her. With a soft finality, across the city, Brooks pulled his cruiser to the side of a quiet overlook where the road dipped slightly, offering a view of the lights stretching across the distance. He placed the vehicle in park and turned off the engine, the world outside settling into a steady hush. He rested his hands on the wheel for a moment, then let them fall to his lap, his gaze fixed forward, not searching, not scanning, just seeing. The reflection of the city lights shimmered faintly across the windshield, broken by the subtle movement of his breathing. He leaned back slightly in the seat, the fabric of the uniform shifting with him, and exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him. Without resistance, he thought about the moment on the road, not as a mistake alone, not as something to replay with regret, but as a point that had redirected something deeper, something that would not show in reports or headlines, but would shape every decision that followed. He lifted his head slightly and looked out at the city again, then reached forward and turned the key, the engine coming back to life, not loud, not forceful, just steady. He placed the cruiser into gear and pulled back onto the road, the tires moving smoothly across the pavement, the lights ahead guiding rather than demanding, both of them moving forward. Now, not connected by proximity, not bound by circumstance, but changed in a way that did not need to be spoken, the night holding their paths quietly as they continued, separate but shaped by the same moment. And somewhere between the fading echo of sirens and the steady rhythm of breath, something simple remained, not loud enough to be declared, but clear enough to be lived. That dignity does not raise its voice. It does not force its presence. It simply stands, steady and undeniable, until even those who once overlooked it can no longer do so.